I'm Jane Garrity, and welcome to my podcast. A Gift of Time is my memoir. I share my experiences through generational trauma, abuse, PTSD, and my spiritual awakening and how I've self-healed. Thank you for listening. If my story resonates with you, it will resonate with others you know. Please share it. Don't forget to hit subscribe and follow so you never miss an episode. Episode 7, 2018. My dad and I put our suitcases in the trunk of the rental car and left Boise for a 3-hour drive to Ketchum, Idaho for a hiking experience in the Sawtooths. I had had a business trip planned and decided that I wanted to stick around and take some time to explore. It wasn't the first time I had visited, and I knew I would be back someday, as those rolling high mountain ranges seemed to be calling my name. The ride along Route 20 was a bit desolate, and I thought of all the people who have never left their hometowns, and I have no idea just how vast and spacious America really is. There were signs to watch for livestock in the road and beige on beige rolling hills, with high peaks in the distance, seeing nothing for miles, and it was glorious. We drove through Haley, past the tiny airport, and found our Airbnb about a mile walk from the center of town. I had secured us a 2-bedroom loft hosted by an artist. There was beautiful artwork all along the walls, a small washer and dryer, a beautiful kitchen, a deck overlooking Ketchum, nestled into the mountains, and it felt like the perfect spot. We didn't waste any time. I had already planned an intro hike for us to get acclimated to the higher altitude, about 30 minutes up the road along Route 75. The hike up to Baker Lake was even more beautiful and imaginative than I thought it would be. There were burn scars along the forest from previous fires. As we hiked up in elevation to the Alpine Lake, we both felt so grateful to experience this beauty and this father-daughter trip. When I had asked my dad if he wanted to go on this trip with me, he didn't hesitate. He said yes right away. The year or so prior, I'd moved out of my boyfriend's home and into my own apartment on the north end of Manchester. I had to let go of yet another failed relationship that seemed to be the same song on repeat, and was living on my own again. I made the commitment to myself that I would never move in with somebody I was in a relationship with ever again. All of my relationships after my divorce came with so much baggage, and then, once leaving, I would pile on new bags, right on top of the old ones I entered in with, and I'd carry them all with me through the revolving doors of each one. The thing about revolving doors is that sometimes we can become stuck in the loops and cycles and forget that we can just exit at any time. When I had met him for the first time and he told me he hadn't really dated or been in a relationship since his divorce, I said, look, I'm not interested in being someone's experience, and perhaps we just see where it goes. After 8 months, he asked me to move in, and I said yes. He had 4 young adult daughters, and his whole world revolved around them. Our vacations always included them, and the weekends were very much like a frat party, with lots of alcohol, flip cup, and beer pong. I loved it. It fed my need for disassociation and disconnection quite perfectly, even though at the time I didn't know that's what I was doing. His daughters seemed to be always fighting, though, especially in the middle of a drunken night, when he would answer the phone and try to talk them all off whatever ledge they happened to be on. I was trying to rebuild my relationship with my own children at this time. They were hurt and in pain and trying to figure out their own lives as young adults after growing up in an abusive household. And I had to force a connection with them. I was the bad guy. I'm the one who left. I was desperate to repair what I had broken, but they were in no real mood for it, and I didn't blame them. I just took whatever crumbs I could get. I was still struggling with nightmares, jumpy and on edge, wondering if there'd be any surprises around the corner that would make me startle. I felt like I was always one surprise away from falling apart. Cigarettes and alcohol were my go-to. It was the glue that kept me from having a nervous breakdown. I was highly functioning, and I knew it. I would try to moderate and find new ways of coping, but it was so much easier slipping into the numbness of alcohol instead of facing myself. One Labor Day weekend, when I was in drinking mode, my dad and stepmom had stopped by for a visit. I wasn't ready to stop the partying, so I went with them to a bar and kept drinking and socializing. It was a Sunday and a holiday. I didn't have to be responsible and go to work, so I let loose. I had called one of my boyfriend's daughters to come and pick me up, to take me home, and if she did, I'd buy her a drink, of course. On our way home, I insisted she stop at the 7-Eleven so that I could just buy a pack of cigarettes, as I just needed one so bad. I thought that I would die if I didn't get it. So she acquiesced and stopped. I gave her money and she came out with a pack. As I stood outside of the car, leaning on the rear, I lit my cig and inhaled the smoke like an addict getting a fix. I felt myself leaning forward a bit, and as I tried to correct my drunken posture, I promptly fell on my face. His daughter freaked out, helped me into the car, and rushed me home. The next thing I remember, I was laying on the bedroom floor in my underwear while my boyfriend and his daughters were fussing over me. I had completely busted my face. They fixed me up as best they could and got me into bed. I woke up the next morning feeling like I was hit by a truck. My lip was broken and bloody where my tooth went through. My cheekbone was burned with pavement and blood. And underneath my eye was nicked in such a way that 1 tiny centimeter made the difference of me being able to see or not. The bruising and abrasions were so bad, I had no idea how I didn't have a fracture or a lost tooth. I told people at work that I had an accident on my bike. I hit a rock, flew over my handlebars, and my face took the brunt of the fall. I was too embarrassed to say I fell while I was drunk. That wasn't even the worst of it. The worst part was just after a couple of days, I wanted to have a drink. And I thought, no, Jane, you have to wait at least a week. What would people think if I picked up the bottle of wine just a couple of days after a tragic, drunken fall that wrecked my face? I knew how I could help it heal from my days as an esthetician, and I was happy with the speedy results by using vitamin E and arnica, and I applied it religiously. The only thing that kept me from having a drink that week was that I had a long hike planned, and I was going to peek back Owl's Head in the Pemigewasset Wilderness. There was no way I would be able to complete an 18-ish mile out and back hike with these injuries coupled with dehydration from alcohol. So I focused on my physical healing and was able to complete the hike and feel good doing it, scars and all. If it wasn't for that planned hike, though, I would have spent that weekend with a box of wine. Hiking had become healing, but it would only last in the moment. When I decided to move out after months of us trying to connect and neither of us being able to communicate with each other, our old conditioning winning the relationship game, I again felt the pull of freedom. It was time for me to leave. His daughters were upset. When his oldest began crying and said, "Not again," I knew that she was still in pain from her own parents' divorce years prior. Shortly after I moved out, we had gone to dinner, and he told me that if I hadn't made the decision to leave, that he would have just kept on accepting everything for what it was and not have done anything about it. I've learned since then that most men behave this way. Instead of trying to find solutions or even making a bold decision to call it quits, they just do nothing instead. They stick with the unconscious status quo because it's easier than having to face their own fears and conditioning. I'm not sure that was the experience he was looking for when we first met, but it's the one he got. When we reached Baker Lake in the remote Idaho wilderness, we sat on a log and cracked open our summit beers. We enjoyed the lake for a bit and talked about the beauty of Idaho and how lucky we were to be able to experience this area of the world. My father has become a local historian in New Hampshire, and prior to that, investigated and put together our family's ancestry. In his hunger for learning the history of people and America, he had become fascinated with visiting cemeteries and old graveyards, looking for clues, pieces of individual people, and learning who really built our country. So when he told me that Ernest Hemingway was buried in the Ketchum Cemetery, I said, "No way." He proceeded to tell me what he had learned about Ernest and his time in Idaho, and while we were there, we planned on visiting some of his favorite spots. We finished our hike and grabbed a quick dinner and made it back to the Airbnb to get a good night's rest. The next day, we had an hours-long drive up to Stanley for a 10-mile hike up and back to Sawtooth Lake. We experienced the drive through the mountains, and then the valley, then the mountains again to find the trailhead. The town of Stanley, Idaho is a small, four-corner crossroad with only a gas station and a general store a bit of a creepy backcountry vibe, and I thought I heard some banjos playing as we drove through. We found the old dirt road that led up to Iron Creek Trailhead and began the bumpy ride up. The hike began in the tall pines, the tallest I had ever seen so far in my life, and the trail was quiet and peaceful. With every turn and junction, we were awed with the beauty of those sawtooths. Once we saw the jagged peaks and rough edges that looked like incisors, we knew how they got their name. When I had moved into my new apartment after the breakup, I was still getting back on my feet financially. Even though I had a great job with a good company, didn't mean that I had it all together. After the divorce, my ex-husband wasn't able to refinance into his own name and buy me out like the divorce decree stated until years later. So when he reached out to let me know that he would need me to sign papers for his refinance, I asked how much was the split. He wasn't willing to give me anything. We went back and forth with emails that were fully loaded. He had no intention of following the decree. He expected that since I left everything behind, combined with everything being my fault in the first place, that I would just follow suit and abandon my half of the house that I paid into for 13 years. After struggling financially for years after the divorce, repairing my credit, paying down debts, weeks with no money left in my account, there was no way in fucking hell I was going to let him get away with this. No matter how many names he called me, how much shame he threw my way, and the continued insults and abuse he still gave me with his words, I had to consult with a lawyer, and he said that I could take it back to the courts if he wasn't willing to follow the decree. So I told him that. I said, it's up to you. You can give me what you owe me, or we can head to court. He told me that it wasn't fair because he needed the extra cash for him and his new wife to do whatever the hell they needed it for. And I was by myself. What did I need it for? I stood my ground, and he finally gave up and agreed to what I was owed, but not without slinging plenty of guilty, shameful mud my way. One evening after work, I went to his house, which used to be my house, sat at the dining room table that I picked out years before with him and his new young wife. I wondered how she slept in the same bed that I did, with the same paint on the walls, with the same abusive man that used to throw shit at my head. I couldn't wait to get my check and leave. I knew that this check meant that I would be able to potentially buy a home for myself someday, and stuck it into my savings account and left it. I felt proud of myself for not giving in and standing my ground for what was rightfully mine, even if I had to wash off all the mud afterwards. This was my first time hiking at any real elevation since high school, and to be able to experience it felt like I was living someone else's life. It was a dream. With each step I took through the tall pines, over water crossings, then the endless switchbacks, elevating high above the first alpine lake, I looked back at its beauty. I stood there catching my breath and feeling the adrenaline of the need to get to the summit, but also wanting to savor the journey. Once we hit the top, we could see Sawtooth Lake peeking through the jagged incisors and whatever limited growth there was that high up. The enormous feeling of being somewhere that was only accessible by foot, after ascending 5 miles and around 2,000 feet in elevation gain, gave me confidence. If I can do this, I can do fucking anything. We had our summit beers and celebrated the conquest in one of the most beautiful, remote places in America, and then headed back down. After cleaning up at our rental, we walked into town to belly up at the Pioneer Saloon, one of Hemingway's favorite places, and we quickly understood why. It was a cool, small mountain town vibe, packed with people, and the food was amazing. I wonder which part of the bar was Ernest's favorite spot. It was packed when we were there. Being tired from hiking, then having a few drinks, I was crying. I tried to tell my dad how awful it was during my marriage. He said, "Oh, let's not ruin a good trip by talking about that stuff." I know it wasn't his intention, but it felt to me that whenever I tried to open up about things to him, I just felt invalidated. He felt bad, and I didn't want him to feel bad, but I also had no idea how to communicate my feelings without losing it. It made him uncomfortable. We managed to get past it and moved on like we always do, but I felt so fragile. One tap on the glass, and it would shatter. When I first moved into that apartment, I was sitting outside on my balcony smoking a butt, and I saw the young men who lived downstairs pull into their spot. They seemed to always be causing a ruckus and partying, and that Friday night I saw them carrying in bottles of wine, beer, and liquor, and it seemed like they were ready for a proper Friday night. So around 9 o'clock, when I had finished the bottle of wine I had, I wanted more. But I also didn't want to drive anywhere. I decided it might be time to meet the neighbors. I got a fresh, clean wine glass, went downstairs in my pajamas, and knocked on their door. It opened a small crack. I saw the young man's face, but he said nothing, just a curious look. "Hi, I'm your new upstairs neighbor, Jane." I held up my wine glass. "You don't happen to have any wine you'd be willing to share, do you?" "Hell yeah, come on in, Jane." We all introduced ourselves and chatted, drinking wine and smoking butts. I began hooking up with one of them, and we all started hanging out on the weekends, partying it up. I would wake up and make breakfast burritos and then head downstairs and I would feed them. It made me happy. I knew I was overcompensating for missing my own kids, but I did it anyway. It was a short-lived relationship that I loved. He showed me how to have fun again without the need for codependency. But his coping mechanisms were so much more hardcore than mine, with drugs and alcohol. I came home at midnight in the middle of the week one time from a business trip, found him passed out on my living room floor, and I knew at that moment it was all done. I was trying to move on from my wounds, and he was still deep inside his own. But it was my relationship with that young man that had me heading back to therapy. He had done 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq and would wake up with nightmares, was jumpy, would flinch a lot, and I could feel his anxiety when we would go anywhere. The terror he had if I drove too close to the white line while he was in the passenger seat. It had me wondering about my own similar experiences with the recurring nightmares and stupid things that would make me jump. The daily anxiety, waiting for a bomb to detonate. I was the bomb. I told my doctor that I was depressed and I wanted an antidepressant and a referral. I didn't tell him that I would spend most nights drinking, crying, texting my sisters and my mother about how much I missed my kids and how much I fucked it all up. He said that I needed grief counseling. When I sat down to this new-to-me therapist's office and told him why I was there, because I missed my kids and I was a terrible mother for leaving them, he was more concerned with my behavior patterns. I didn't know anything about cognitive behavior therapy, but I was willing to try anything. So when he asked me questions about how I slept and the night terrors, I told him my experience. And when he asked me about my anxiety and asked for examples, being jumpy, and do I startle easily, and how are your relationships? I asked him back, wait, do you think I have PTSD? Which I would have never even thought to ask if I hadn't dated that young man and witnessed his. He said, absolutely you do. He asked me about my marriage, and he was the first person that heard me speak about it openly and didn't interrupt me and just listened. And after all of those years, I finally felt validated. Validated that the abuse that I sustained for 20 years is why I was experiencing PTSD, depression, alcohol abuse, and my body was still in survival mode and ready for the next battle. They say time heals all wounds, but I don't believe that to be true anymore. Time is just time. If we're not properly healing our physical bodies and understanding the emotional wounds, then time does nothing. For our last day in Ketchum, we rented some bikes and rode all over town. I was tired and cranky, and my dad had to put up with me that day, but it was worth it. There was a celebration with a live band in the courtyard, so after we brought our bikes back, we walked over and took part in the celebration. We enjoyed the band, met new people, had some great conversations, and really enjoyed just being in the present moment and being together. I decided that maybe I wanted to move and live there. The vibe in that small mountain town was one I wanted to maintain. Friendly, easy, walkable, hike just up the road. The standard uniform was boots, shorts, and a puffy jacket because the mornings were cold and the afternoons were warm. The gas stations were all named Base Camp and everyone skied or played golf. But it also seemed like one of those towns where the people who worked there probably couldn't afford to live there at the same time. I said to my dad, they have no vape shops here. I could open one up. After the time I lived with my mother, I learned that by me wanting her to be different so that we could have the mother-daughter relationship I always wanted, that I had been going about it all wrong. I had intuitively come to the conclusion that I had to stop wanting my mother to be something that she wasn't. The more I wanted our relationship to be one of open communication without judgment, the more resistance I would feel and constantly triggered by her. If I wanted to have the relationship with my mother that I always wanted, I had to accept her exactly how she was. Once I had been settled into that apartment on the north end, I decided that I wanted to build a relationship with her, and this time without my own expectations. I had to stop expecting her to be something she wasn't, just as much as I wished she stopped with her expectations of me. I learned that there was a cribbage league in Goffstown and asked her if she wanted to join it with me. We could be partners once a week, and we would have that time, both doing something that we each enjoyed together. I made it a priority each week. I declined work events and anything else that came up or that I was invited to at the same time. I blocked my calendar, and I said no to all of them. This once a week time with my mom comes first. It was an investment with purpose. I left work a little early on those evenings, and I would even pick her up along the way. We both came to cherish our cribbage nights together, and when the pandemic happened, when we had to stop, we would tell each other how much we missed it. We learned about each other in a new way. I realized that in order to create change in my relationships, at least the change that I wanted to see, I had to begin with myself and change the way I communicate and love. She didn't need to change at all. I had countless relationships with men after my divorce and always left each one feeling abandoned in some way. This year I was seeing someone new again and had a trip planned through work where I could invite a +1. So I invited him. He said, "Yeah, sure, I'll go with you." Then 2 days before we were to get on that flight, he backed out. I was livid. All I saw was red. How could he do this to me at the last minute? I was most upset that he just didn't decline in the first place, as I could have brought somebody else, like one of my sisters. My company had already paid for his flight and particulars, and I felt embarrassed too, having to go to my events team and let them know that the money was wasted, thrown away, just like me. Can I change the ticket to somebody else? Does anybody else want to go the day after tomorrow on such short notice? I was left to take the trip alone, and the anger that I had inside myself, that this man was waiting until the last minute to cancel so that I couldn't even re-swizzle plans with someone else, had me fuming. The anger that I felt was like nothing like I had felt before. It burned, the heavy gut. Then, out of my mind, rage. The constant abandonment in my relationships had finally gotten me to the point of boiling over. I ended up having a good time, a much better time than I would have if he had gone, and from then on, I had no trust with him at all. He was talking about moving forward in the relationship and even mentioned to one of his siblings in front of me that I should move in with him. I immediately said, "What makes you think I would want to do that after you leaving me high and dry? Fuck that." I was in no way moving in with someone who couldn't keep a commitment for a free trip. How would he be as a partner? My dad and I did laundry and packed up our things to head back to Boise to have one last hurrah before our early flights the next day. The last stop before leaving Ketchum was to the cemetery. As we drove in, my dad said, "Okay, he and the family should be right over there somewhere, in one of those rows, under one of the trees." Could you be a little more specific, Dad? He hopped out of the car and started looking, and of course he found it right away, in one of those rows, under one of the trees. Ernest Miller Hemingway, July 21, 1899 to July 2nd, 1961. There were some empty liquor bottles and tons of pennies. I learned that people left him booze so that he could still partake in the afterlife. And the pennies were for that infamous time when his wife Pauline spent all of his money on a pool at their home in Key West. So as he threw his last penny in the pool, he said, "Pauline, you spent all but my last penny, so you may as well have this one too." Overall, my dad and I did well, I think, as that was the first trip we ever had together, at least that I remember anyway, and I was 47. I was finally feeling at a good place with my career and the money I was making, even though I knew that I wasn't making what my counterparts were. When you manage people that make more money than you, it's a hard pill to swallow. What? But I manage them. Because they have tenure with the company? What about my tenure and experience as a whole, including what I brought with me? When I had decided to take the management role, it had come after a long year of having no real manager to speak of. My manager had died, suddenly and tragically, and the senior VP of our department became paralyzed by it. He was unable to find a suitable replacement, and one of the solutions was to create another layer so that people like me could move up versus the wide gap that was there at the time. That year, myself and another product manager managing the largest revenue-producing business unit in the company did it mostly alone. We made mistakes, for sure, but we were also extremely successful. So, when that new position came up, I thought, why not go for it? And I got the offer. But it wasn't for much more than I was making, and this role meant I would be managing people and their business units, including the one I was still managing. I went to the only remaining director at the time for some advice. I wanted to counter my offer. I knew it was under what I should be making. But I felt unsure. I think perhaps just not much confidence because it was also maybe asking an exec. I was looking for validation and someone outside of myself to give it to me. I will never forget his response when he answered me. He said to me that I would never have even gotten the opportunity unless someone had died that year, so I'd better be grateful for it. What a prick. I was pissed. So I used that energy and decided to counter anyway. Nothing to lose, I thought. As I sat in the senior VP's office with my presentation in hand, full to the brim of value, vision, and goals, and asked for more money, he chuckled. He said, "This is a significant increase, Jane." I said, "Well, obviously I was underpaid to begin with." He said, "I'm sorry, there's no more room." I said, "Okay, then I want to negotiate more PTO in place of it." And he still said no. He knew I would take the position, and I did. I wanted the experience, notoriety, and career path, so I accepted it. There were about 5 of us in total, and when it came time for us to move into our new double-wide manager cubicles, there wasn't enough to go around. There was one short. The one that was assigned to me had a huge HVAC beam from floor to ceiling, right in the middle of that, and it vibrated and hummed at intervals throughout the day. I would later joke about it, develop a twitch. I asked why I had to get that one, and why couldn't we figure out a better solution so that I could be at the same level as my peers. That same director, who said I wouldn't even have had the opportunity unless somebody died, said I had the lowest tenure, so I had no choice. Fucking asshole. I decided to embrace it, and it slowly became the best half double-wide cubicle in the place, always buzzing with activity, laughs, and collaboration. It was because my team made it that way, not me. It didn't start out like that, though. I made tons of mistakes. I said stupid things to my team and led with ego. But I also wasn't afraid to listen to them and share my own vulnerabilities and similar stories, and I liked to try new things. So if they came to me with an idea, I said, "Go, do it. I support you. How can I help?" We learn as we go. When we know better, we do better. I had slowly come to realize that the size of my paycheck and the size of my cube had nothing to do with actual leadership. I had created a safe space for my team and others in that community, in that undersized, twitchy cube. I had become obsessed with learning how to lead versus learning how to manage. I listened to audiobooks and podcasts every day that focused on being a leader, how to become emotionally intelligent. Each day on my drive in, I would say to myself, I'm here for the people. I'm here for my team, not anything else. No matter how many times I asked for more money that I knew I was worth and deserved to at least be at the same level of my male counterparts, it was always the same wall. It's not the time to ask, Jane. Okay, then what about hiring another peer to split my large 21-person team? Nothing ever happened. It was always the same. It would be good for me to mention that during the pandemic, and after 4 years in that position, I finally got my full-size manager cube. And I was told the raise was on its way, right as I gave my resignation. I always wondered if that was even true or if that was just something I was told, a way to stick it to me, I guess. I was fully aware that once women hit a certain level in that organization, they all left. No women in leadership there. When I see pictures from that company today on LinkedIn, it's still the same men at the top. I made the right decision. As we drove out of Ketchum, talking about Ernest and his impact on this tiny community, I felt grateful for this trip with my dad. We had our moments, especially mine, but it was so nice to spend the time learning from one another. I learned that my trouble communicating came from decades of not feeling heard. I didn't feel heard by my parents all those years ago, never felt heard by my ex-husband or my managers at work. I had been conditioned to keep the peace by not saying anything at all. I accepted it as truth, but it was lies. I had the power inside me all along. I just didn't know it. We got back to Boise early Sunday afternoon, dropped off the rental, checked into the hotel room we were sharing, and then Ubered to a brewery. We left there and went downtown and began bar hopping. My dad said there was a drag show at one of the bars, and I said, let's fucking go. I don't remember much, except that we had a great time, and we got back to the hotel very late, and I was so wasted. How was I going to get up for my ride to the airport at 4:30 in the morning? The worst part was sharing a room with my dad and getting up at 2 in the morning and puking my guts out in my underwear. We had different flights back to Boston, and it was probably a good thing because I was so hungover. I don't think I would have been very nice to him. Of all the experiences I've had with my dad, this was by far the best yet. Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 7. If you are enjoying my podcast, please share it with others. I appreciate each and every one of you that have been reaching out to me. Subscribe and follow, like, share. Thank you.